The salt spray stung Commander Joseph Rochefort's eyes as he stood on the deck of the USS Enterprise, watching the crimson dawn break over the Pacific horizon. In his hand, he clutched a decoded Japanese message that would either save or doom the American fleet. The date was June 1st, 1942, and the Empire of Japan was about to make its boldest gamble yet. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of that surprise assault, was preparing to deliver what he believed would be the final crushing blow to American naval power in the Pacific. His target, the tiny coral atoll of Midway, a strategic outpost that served as America's westernmost defense in the Central Pacific. Yamamoto's plan was audacious in its scope and complexity. He would deploy nearly the entire combined fleet, over 160 ships including 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. The Kido Butai, the same carrier strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, would spearhead the assault under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The Japanese admiral was confident that the Americans would rush their remaining carriers to defend Midway, where they would be destroyed in a decisive battle that would force the United States to sue for peace. But Yamamoto had made a critical error. He had underestimated the genius of American codebreakers who had cracked the Japanese naval cipher known as JN-25. Commander Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had been intercepting and decoding Japanese communications for months, and they had uncovered the broad outline of Yamamoto's plan. The intelligence was fragmentary but compelling. The Japanese referred to their target as AF, and through a clever ruse involving a false radio transmission about Midway's water purification system, Rochefort had confirmed that AF was indeed Midway. The attack was scheduled for June 4th, and the Japanese would approach from the northwest with overwhelming force. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, faced an agonizing decision. He had only 3 operational carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, against Japan's 6. The smart tactical move would be to avoid battle and preserve his fleet. But Nimitz understood that this might be America's only chance to catch the Japanese carriers vulnerable, while they were focused on attacking Midway. As reported by naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison in his comprehensive work, History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, Nimitz decided to risk everything on a single throw of the dice. He would position his carriers northeast of Midway, where they could launch a surprise attack on the Japanese fleet while it was engaged in bombing the atoll. The stage was set for one of the most crucial naval battles in history. On June 2nd, the American task forces commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher began their approach to the designated ambush position. The Yorktown, still bearing scars from the Battle of the Coral Sea, just a month earlier, had been repaired in a miraculous 72 hours at Pearl Harbor, a feat that should have taken 3 months. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet steamed eastward through the northern Pacific, shrouded in fog and confident in their numerical superiority. Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had never tasted defeat. Their veteran pilots had dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, and they approached Midway with the supreme confidence of warriors who had known only victory. As the sun set on June 2nd, both fleets were converging on a patch of ocean that would soon become a graveyard for ships and men. The Americans had the advantage of foreknowledge, but the Japanese had superior numbers and experience. In less than 48 hours, the fate of the Pacific War would be decided in the skies above a tiny coral atoll that most Americans had never heard of. The die was cast, and there would be no turning back. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines as the first wave of Japanese bombers lifted off from the flight decks of the Kido Butai. 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers loaded with high-explosive bombs, 36 Aichi-Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters formed up in the purple twilight and headed southeast toward Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, leading the strike force, had orders to neutralize Midway's defenses in preparation for the amphibious assault scheduled for the following day. As his formation approached the atoll, he could see the white coral beaches and the tiny airstrip that would soon be under Japanese control. But Midway was not as defenseless as the Japanese had assumed. The American garrison on Midway, commanded by Colonel Harold Shannon of the Marines, had been alerted by the codebreakers' intelligence. Every available aircraft had been launched before dawn: obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, ancient Vindicator dive bombers, and even a handful of Army Air Force flying fortresses. The defenders knew they were outmatched, but they would sell their lives dearly. The air battle over Midway began at 6:24 in the morning. The Japanese bombers, escorted by the deadly Zero fighters, swept in from the northwest like a hurricane of steel and fire. The American defenders rose to meet them in aircraft that were already obsolete when the war began. Marine Captain John Carey, flying one of the doomed Buffalo fighters, managed to shoot down a Japanese bomber before his own aircraft was torn apart by cannon fire from a Zero. Despite the heroic resistance, the Japanese attack was devastating. Bombs rained down on the Marine positions, destroying fuel dumps, damaging the airstrip and killing dozens of defenders. But the runway remained operational, and more importantly, Lieutenant Tominaga radioed back to Admiral Nagumo that a second attack would be necessary to completely neutralize the base. This message would prove to be one of the most fateful communications in naval history. Admiral Nagumo faced a crucial decision. Should he launch the second wave immediately with the aircraft he had kept in reserve, or should he wait to rearm them with armor-piercing bombs designed for attacking ships? The Japanese admiral had received reports of American ships in the area, but he believed they were only cruisers and destroyers. He decided to prepare for the second attack on Midway, but the Americans were already striking back. At 7:05, the first wave of American aircraft found the Japanese fleet. The attack was a disaster. The obsolete torpedo bombers from Midway, flying without fighter escort, were slaughtered by the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. Not a single torpedo hit its target, and most of the brave airmen who had launched the attack never returned. According to military historian Gordon Pranga's definitive account, Miracle at Midway, the morning attacks by land-based aircraft from Midway achieved nothing except to convince Admiral Nagumo that the Americans posed no serious threat. The Japanese admiral grew increasingly confident as wave after wave of American attackers were shot down or missed their targets entirely. Unknown to Nagumo, the American carriers were closing in from the northeast. Admiral Spruance had launched his strike force from the Enterprise and Hornet at 7:02, sending 116 aircraft racing toward the Japanese fleet. The attack was a calculated gamble. Spruance was launching at maximum range, leaving his pilots with barely enough fuel to return to their carriers. As the morning wore on, the Japanese fleet continued its methodical preparation for the second strike on Midway. On the hangar decks of the four carriers, ordnance crews worked frantically to rearm the aircraft. Torpedoes were removed and replaced with bombs, then bombs were removed and replaced with torpedoes as conflicting orders came down from the bridge. The flight decks were cluttered with fuel lines, ammunition, and aircraft in various states of readiness. At 9:18, the Japanese lookout spotted the first American dive bombers approaching from the southeast. But these were obsolete Vindicators from Midway, and they posed no real threat to the maneuvering carriers. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol shot down most of them, and the survivors' bombs missed their targets by wide margins. Admiral Nagumo was becoming impatient. His ships had been under sporadic attack for over 2 hours, and while none of the American efforts had been successful, the constant harassment was delaying his schedule. He decided to launch the second attack on Midway immediately, using whatever aircraft were ready. At 10:24, the Akagi began launching aircraft for the second strike on Midway. The other carriers followed suit, and soon the sky was filled with Japanese bombers and fighters heading southeast toward the atoll. But this decision would leave the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch, and their hangar decks filled with fuel and ammunition. The stage was set for the most decisive 30 minutes in naval aviation history. High above the Pacific, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers were approaching the Japanese fleet, their pilots pushing their aircraft to the limits of their range and endurance. The fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance, and neither side yet realized how quickly fortune could change in the crucible of battle. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey gripped the controls of his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber as he scanned the empty ocean below. It was 10:35 on the morning of June 4th, and the Enterprise Air Group was lost. They had been flying for over 2 hours, their fuel gauges dropping toward the point of no return, and still there was no sign of the Japanese fleet. McCluskey had made a critical decision 30 minutes earlier. When his formation reached the expected position of the enemy carriers and found only empty ocean, most commanders would have turned back to save fuel. Instead, McCluskey had chosen to extend the search, gambling that the Japanese had changed course. His pilots were now flying on fumes, and if he was wrong, the entire squadron would be forced to ditch in the Pacific. Then, at 10:55, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast across the blue Pacific. The Arashi had been detached from the main fleet to hunt down the American submarine Nautilus, which had been shadowing the Japanese force since dawn. Now, as the destroyer hurried to rejoin the fleet, it was leaving a white wake that pointed, like an arrow, toward Admiral Nagumo's carriers. McCluskey followed the wake, and at 11:05 he saw them. 4 Japanese carriers spread across the ocean in a diamond formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft. The Akagi, flagship of the Kido Butai, was in the center, flanked by the Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. It was the most powerful concentration of naval aviation in the world, and it was about to be caught completely off guard. The timing was perfect, and perfectly accidental. For the past 2 hours, the Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level, fighting off successive waves of American torpedo bombers. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet had been annihilated, with only Ensign George Gay surviving, to watch the battle from his life raft. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise had suffered similar losses, and Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown was just beginning its doomed attack. The gallant sacrifice of the torpedo bomber crews had not been in vain. Their low-level attacks had pulled the Japanese fighters down to the deck, leaving the high altitude clear for the dive bombers. Moreover, the constant harassment had delayed the Japanese launch schedule, leaving their flight decks crowded with fuel and ordnance, a perfect target for dive bombing attack. At 11:22, McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive, followed by the rest of Bombing Squadron 6. At the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Bombing Squadron 3 from the Yorktown into their attack dives. The Japanese lookouts spotted the American dive bombers just as they began their final approach, but it was too late to launch fighters or even to sound the general alarm. The first bomb hit the Akagi at 11:26. Lieutenant Dick Best, flying McCluskey's wing, had singled out the flagship for his attack. His 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck just behind the bridge and exploded in the hangar deck, where it ignited fuel and ammunition from the aircraft being prepared for launch. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was a blazing inferno. The Kaga died next. Multiple bombs struck the big carrier, and she too erupted in flames as her fuel and ammunition exploded. The Soryu, smallest of the 4 carriers, was hit by 3 bombs from the Yorktown's dive bombers and was abandoned within 20 minutes as fires spread throughout the ship. As documented in Walter Lord's classic account, Incredible Victory, the attack lasted less than 5 minutes, but it changed the course of the Pacific War. In those brief moments, Japan lost 3 of its 4 fleet carriers and most of their irreplaceable veteran pilots. The Kido Butai, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, was suddenly reduced to a single operational carrier. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the burning Akagi, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The ship that had carried him to victory at Pearl Harbor was now a funeral pyre, her steel plates buckling from the heat of internal explosions. At 11:46, he transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara, leaving behind the burning wreckage of his dreams of conquest. But the battle was far from over. The Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, had been separated from the other 3 carriers and had escaped the devastating attack. Yamaguchi was one of Japan's most aggressive admirals, and he was determined to strike back. At 11:45, just as the other carriers were succumbing to their wounds, he launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American fleet. The Japanese counterstrike found the Yorktown at 12:05. Despite the heroic efforts of her combat air patrol, 3 bombs struck the carrier, knocking out her boilers and causing severe damage. The Yorktown listed heavily to port and seemed to be sinking, but her damage control parties were among the best in the Navy. By 2:02, they had corrected the list and restored power, making the carrier appear undamaged to Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. This led to a fatal Japanese miscalculation. When the Hiryu launched her second strike at 1:05, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros, Admiral Yamaguchi believed he was attacking a different carrier. He thought the Americans had at least 2 carriers in the area, when in fact they had 3. The Yorktown was struck by 2 torpedoes in the second attack and finally had to be abandoned, but the Enterprise and Hornet remained untouched and ready to strike back. The morning of June 4th had seen the most dramatic reversal of fortune in naval history. The Japanese had begun the day with overwhelming superiority, possessing 6 carriers against the Americans' 3. Now, as the sun reached its zenith over the Pacific, the situation was reversed. The Americans had 2 operational carriers, while the Japanese had only 1. The battle for Midway was entering its final phase, and the hunters had become the hunted. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, as Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher checked his dive bomber one final time. It was 3:32 on June 4th, and the Enterprise Air Group was preparing to launch what might be the final strike of the Battle of Midway. The target was the Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, and every pilot knew that the outcome of the Pacific War could depend on the success of this mission. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the quiet former cruiser commander who had taken over Task Force 16 after Admiral Halsey fell ill, was taking no chances. He had launched every available aircraft from both the Enterprise and Hornet, 24 dive bombers, 8 fighters, and even a few torpedo planes that had been repaired. Since the morning's disasters, the Yorktown, now listing heavily and abandoned by most of her crew, could contribute nothing to this final effort. The Hiryu was not going down without a fight. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, the most aggressive of Japan's carrier commanders, had already launched 2 strikes against the American fleet, and he was preparing a third. His ship was the last hope of the Kido Butai, and he was determined to take as many American ships with him as possible. At 4:10, the Enterprise dive bombers found their target. The Hiryu was steaming northeast at high speed, her flight deck crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. Unlike the morning attack, this time the Japanese were ready. The combat air patrol had been reinforced, and the ship's anti-aircraft guns opened fire as soon as the American bombers began their approach. Lieutenant Gallagher led the first section down through the flak, his Dauntless shuddering from the concussion of exploding shells. At 3,000 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of his dive just as Zero fighters swept in from both sides. The bomb hit the Hiryu's flight deck just forward of the bridge, penetrating to the hangar deck where it exploded among the fueled and armed aircraft. The attack was devastating, but not immediately fatal. The Hiryu's damage control parties were as skilled as any in the Japanese Navy, and they managed to contain the initial fires. For a brief moment, it seemed the carrier might survive. But then Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, no relation to Wilmer, scored a direct hit with his bomb on the forward elevator. The explosion ruptured fuel lines and ignited ammunition, and within minutes the entire forward section of the ship was ablaze. More bombs followed. The Hornet's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Walter Rhodey, added their weight to the attack. By 4:30, the Hiryu was a blazing wreck, her flight deck buckled and her hangar decks filled with smoke and flame. The last of the Kido Butai's carriers was finished. Admiral Yamaguchi faced the same terrible decision that had confronted Nagumo earlier in the day. His flagship was dying, and he could either transfer his flag to another ship or go down with his command. Yamaguchi chose death. According to survivors' accounts documented in Mitsuo Fuchida's memoir, Midway, the Battle That Doomed Japan, the admiral sent a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. "I am partly responsible for the defeat of the Kido Butai. I will remain with the Hiryu and share her fate." The Hiryu continued to burn through the evening, Her crew fought valiantly to save their ship, but the fires had spread too far and the damage was too extensive. At 7:30, Captain Tomeo Kaku gave the order to abandon ship. The carrier would survive until the following morning, when she finally rolled over and sank, taking Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku with her. With the destruction of the Hiryu, the Battle of Midway was effectively over. The Japanese had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and over 300 aircraft. More importantly, they had lost many of their most experienced pilots, men who had trained for years and could not be quickly replaced. The Kido Butai, which had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, had been destroyed in a single day. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, was stunned by the reports reaching him. The man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor and had promised the Emperor a decisive victory at Midway was faced with the greatest naval defeat in Japanese history. At 2:55 in the morning of June 5th, he made the painful decision to cancel the Midway operation and withdraw the entire fleet. The American victory was complete, but it had come at a heavy cost. The Yorktown, despite the heroic efforts of her crew, was still listing heavily and would eventually be lost to a Japanese submarine. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been virtually annihilated, and many other squadrons had suffered severe losses. The price of victory at Midway was measured in the blood of brave young men who had given their lives to turn the tide of war. As reported in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official history, the Battle of Midway marked the beginning of the end for Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Never again would the Rising Sun's fleet venture forth with the confidence and strength that had carried them to victory after victory in the war's early months. The initiative had passed to the Americans, and it would never return to Japan. The sun was setting on June 4th, 1942, and with it was setting the dream of Japanese dominance in the Pacific. The 4 days that shifted the balance of power in the Pacific were drawing to a close, but their consequences would echo through the remaining 3 years of the war. The dawn of June 5th, 1942, revealed a Pacific Ocean littered with the debris of battle. Oil slicks marked the graves of sunken ships, and life rafts dotted the swells as survivors waited for rescue or death. The Battle of Midway was over, but the human cost was still being counted as search planes from both sides scoured the waters for their comrades. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, reading the preliminary battle reports with a mixture of elation and sorrow. The victory was beyond his most optimistic hopes. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed against the loss of 1 American carrier and a destroyer. But the names of the dead were already beginning to arrive, and each one represented a family that would never be the same. The USS Yorktown, the gallant carrier that had been rushed from the Coral Sea to fight at Midway, was still afloat, but barely. Salvage crews had managed to board the abandoned ship and were attempting to tow her back to Pearl Harbor when disaster struck. At 1:36 in the afternoon, the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Commander Yahachi Tanabe, fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the listing carrier. 2 struck home, and the Yorktown finally succumbed to her wounds, taking 68 of her crew with her to the bottom. The destroyer USS Hammond, which had been alongside the Yorktown providing power and pumps for the salvage effort, was also hit by one of the submarine's torpedoes. She broke in half and sank in just 4 minutes with the loss of 80 men. The sea that had given the Americans such a decisive victory now claimed its final victims of the battle. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet was in full retreat, but their losses continued to mount. The heavy cruiser Mikuma, damaged in a collision with her sister ship Mogami during the night withdrawal, was caught by American dive bombers on June 6th and bombed to destruction. The Mogami, heavily damaged but still afloat, limped back to truck with her stern blown off and hundreds of her crew dead or wounded. The human stories emerging from the battle were as varied as they were tragic. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was picked up by a PBY Catalina flying boat after 30 hours in the water. He had watched the entire battle from his life raft, including the destruction of the Japanese carriers, and his eyewitness account would become one of the most vivid records of the action. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave of attackers at Pearl Harbor, was aboard the Akagi when she was bombed, He had been hospitalized with appendicitis and was carried from the burning ship on a stretcher, his legs broken when he was dropped during the evacuation. The man who had symbolized Japanese naval aviation's early victories was now a witness to its greatest defeat. The strategic implications of the battle were immediately apparent to military leaders on both sides. Japan had lost not just 4 carriers but also the cream of her naval aviation, pilots who had trained for years and possessed combat experience that could not be replaced. The Zero fighters and Val dive bombers could be manufactured in Japanese factories, but the men who flew them were irreplaceable, as documented in John Keegan's comprehensive study, The Price of Admiralty. The Battle of Midway represented a fundamental shift in the balance of naval power in the Pacific. The United States, with its massive industrial capacity, could replace its losses within months. Japan, already stretched thin by its far-flung conquests, would never again be able to mount an offensive operation on the scale of the Midway attack. The battle also marked a turning point in American morale. The 6 months following Pearl Harbor had been a litany of disasters: Wake Island, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore. American forces had been in retreat across the Pacific, and many wondered if the United States could ever match the seemingly invincible Japanese war machine. Midway proved that American courage and ingenuity could triumph over numerical superiority. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Midway operation, was devastated by the defeat. The man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year had seen his prediction come true in the most dramatic fashion possible. The window of opportunity had closed, and now Japan would have to fight a defensive war against an enemy with vastly superior resources. The emperor himself was reportedly shocked by the news of the defeat. The Japanese public was told nothing of the disaster. The government censors suppressed all news of the battle, and the returning ships were quarantined to prevent word from spreading. But the families of the 3,000 sailors and airmen who had died at Midway eventually learned the truth, and the myth of Japanese invincibility began to crumble. For the United States, Midway represented vindication of the decision to fight a 2-ocean war. The victory proved that American naval aviation could hold its own against the best the Japanese could offer, and it provided the foundation for the island-hopping campaign that would eventually carry American forces to the gates of Japan itself. The 4 days that had shifted the balance of power in the Pacific were over, but their consequences would reverberate for the remainder of the war. Japan's offensive capability had been broken, and the long road to Tokyo could now begin. The silence that settled over the Pacific on June 7, 1942, was profound and ominous. Where once the thunder of naval guns and the roar of aircraft engines had echoed across the waves, there was now only the whisper of wind and the gentle lapping of swells against floating debris. The Battle of Midway was over, but its legacy would shape the course of the Pacific War and alter the destiny of nations. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's headquarters was a scene of barely controlled chaos. Staff officers who had been planning victory, parades and occupation ceremonies just days before now faced the grim task of explaining to Emperor Hirohito how the mightiest naval force in Japanese history had been destroyed in a single day. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, struggled to find words that could soften the blow of such a catastrophic defeat. The truth was almost impossible to accept. The Kido Butai, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months and had never known defeat, was gone. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carriers whose names had struck terror into the hearts of Japan's enemies, now lay on the bottom of the Pacific, their aircraft and crews entombed in steel sarcophagi 2 miles beneath the waves. Admiral Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who had conceived both the Pearl Harbor attack and the Midway operation, was a broken man. He had gambled everything on one decisive battle and had lost. The admiral who had warned his government that Japan must achieve a quick victory or face inevitable defeat had seen his prediction come true in the most dramatic fashion possible. The strategic implications of the defeat were immediately apparent to the more perceptive Japanese leaders. Without the Kido Butai, Japan could no longer project power across the vast Pacific. The carrier force that had made possible the conquests of the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma was gone, and with it went Japan's ability to conduct major offensive operations. More critically, Japan had lost the one resource that could not be replaced: experienced naval aviators. The pilots who had died at Midway represented years of training and months of combat experience. They had learned their deadly craft in the skies over China and had perfected it in the early battles of the Pacific War. Their replacements would be hastily trained youngsters who would never match the skill and experience of the men who had died with their carriers. In Washington, the reaction was jubilant, but tempered by the knowledge of how close the battle had been. President Franklin Roosevelt, who had endured 6 months of unrelenting bad news from the Pacific, finally had a victory to celebrate. But the cost had been high. Over 300 American airmen had died at Midway, and the Navy's torpedo, bomber squadrons had been virtually annihilated. The strategic significance of the victory was not lost on American military leaders. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, immediately began planning for offensive operations in the Pacific. The victory at Midway had provided the breathing space needed to build up American forces for a counter-offensive that would eventually carry the war to Japan's home islands. According to the official Navy history compiled by Samuel Eliot Morison, the Battle of Midway marked the beginning of a new phase in the Pacific War. The period of Japanese expansion was over, and the long American drive across the Central Pacific could now begin. The victory had been achieved by a combination of superior intelligence, courageous leadership, and the sacrifice of brave men who had given their lives to turn the tide of war. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw a frantic effort by both sides to rebuild their carrier forces. The United States, with its massive industrial capacity, was already launching new carriers at an unprecedented rate. The Essex-class carriers, larger and more powerful than any ship in the world, were rolling off the ways of American shipyards. By war's end, the United States would operate over 100 carriers of various sizes. Japan, by contrast, struggled to replace its losses. The few remaining carriers were pressed into service as training ships, desperately trying to prepare new pilots for the battles ahead. But the industrial capacity was lacking, and more importantly, the time was running out. The new pilots who would replace the veterans lost at Midway would have only a fraction of the training and experience of their predecessors. The battle also marked the emergence of new technologies that would dominate naval warfare for the rest of the war. Radar, which had been in its infancy in 1942, would soon become the eyes of the fleet. Improved aircraft, better weapons, and new tactics would all flow from the lessons learned in the 4 days of battle around Midway. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of Midway demonstrated the decisive importance of intelligence in modern warfare. The American victory had been made possible by the codebreakers who had penetrated Japanese naval communications and provided Admiral Nimitz with the information he needed to position his forces for maximum effect. The battle proved that in the age of global warfare, information was as valuable as ships and aircraft. The men who fought at Midway would go on to fight in other battles, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, but they would never forget the 4 days in June when the course of the Pacific War was decided. They had witnessed the moment when the tide turned, when the hunters became the hunted, and when the American eagle finally spread its wings over the Pacific. The Battle of Midway was over, but its legacy would endure. It had shifted the balance of power in the Pacific, marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat, and set the stage for America's ultimate victory. The 4 days that changed the world had passed into history, but their significance would be felt for generations to come.